Welcome to the fourth episode of our series The USA History on Speaking History channel. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution, one of the most monumental movements in history, was not just a sudden burst of rebellion in 1775 but the culmination of growing discontent and desire for freedom. For years, the colonists viewed British rule as a barrier rather than a benefit, seeking independence to shape their own destiny. Simultaneously, British missteps and rigid control only fueled the colonists' resolve, leading to a revolutionary confrontation. Causes of the Revolution. The American perspective. By the 18th century, the people living in America had evolved differently from their ancestors who had migrated from England in the 17th century. These colonists were descendants of dissenters, radicals, and those who had fled Europe's oppressive religious policies. Having found more freedom and tolerance in America than in Europe, they felt a stronger allegiance to their new home. Over time, the once shared identity with England faded, leading to a deep-seated disconnect between the two populations. The British perspective. The British saw America as their colony, with the colonists expected to serve the interests of their mother country. To reinforce this control, they placed the colonies under royal authority, with governors wielding vast powers on behalf of the British Crown. The colonial governments, however, began asserting more independence, particularly in matters of taxation and self-governance, setting the stage for a clash between imperial control and the colonies' desire for autonomy. Mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. British policies like mercantilism dictated that colonies existed solely to benefit the mother country, serving as sources of raw materials and markets for British goods. This approach stifled colonial self-government and led to a series of navigation acts aimed at controlling colonial trade. These acts, including the Enumerated Commodities Act and the Molasses Act, were resented by colonists, who saw them as an infringement on their economic freedoms. Restrictions on manufacturing. British laws also restricted the colonies from manufacturing certain goods like woolen items and luxury goods, forcing them to import these from Britain. Acts like the Woolen Act, Hat Act, and Iron Act exacerbated colonial resentment, as they were seen as deliberate attempts to keep the colonies economically dependent on Britain. The removal of the French threat. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 eliminated French influence in North America, removing a significant threat to the colonies. Without the fear of a French-British alliance, the colonies no longer felt the need for British protection, leading to a shift in their relationship with England. The British, however, failed to recognize this shift and continued to view America as an integral part of their empire, a view the colonists were no longer willing to accept. Grenville's policies. The war with France left Britain with a massive debt, and Prime Minister George Grenville expected the colonies to help pay it off. This led to the introduction of several new taxes, which were deeply resented by the colonists and ultimately contributed to their push for independence. Crown's Proclamation, 1763. Grenville's proclamation aimed to appease the Native Americans by restricting colonial expansion westward, angering settlers who saw it as a hindrance to their growth. The Sugar Act, 1764. This act aimed to raise revenue and curb colonial smuggling by imposing taxes on imported goods like sugar and luxury items, further straining relations. The Quartering Act, 1765. This law required colonists to house and supply British troops, shifting the financial burden of the army onto the colonies and leading to widespread discontent. The Stamp Act, 1765. This act imposed taxes on all official documents, newspapers, and legal papers, sparking intense colonial protests and leading to the first unified resistance against British rule. The colonies argued that only their own assemblies had the right to tax them, not the British Parliament. Colonial response. The Stamp Act led to widespread protests across the colonies. Massachusetts took the lead by organizing a Congress to oppose the act, and groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged to resist its implementation. Their efforts, combined with growing support from sympathetic British statesmen, eventually led to the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, a significant victory for the colonists. Declaratory Act and the Townshend Programme. Even as the Stamp Act was repealed, Britain passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This was followed by the Townshend Programme, which imposed new duties on goods like tea and paper and reorganized customs enforcement to ensure compliance. The colonists responded with boycotts and protests, further escalating tensions. Resistance and the road to revolution. As the British tightened their grip, the colonists grew increasingly united in their resistance. Non-importation agreements were signed, and influential writings like John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania articulated the constitutional issues at stake. Samuel Adams' circular letter further mobilized colonial assemblies against British policies, leading to the dissolution of several assemblies by the British government. The Boston Massacre and beyond. In 1770, tensions reached a boiling point with the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers killed several colonists during a confrontation. This event deepened the rift between the colonists and British authorities, with annual commemorations fueling anti-British sentiment. Incidents like the burning of the Gaspee further soured relations, making reconciliation increasingly unlikely. Lord North's measures. In 1770, Lord North became Prime Minister and attempted to ease tensions by repealing some of the Townshend duties. However, he retained the tax on tea, setting the stage for further conflict. As the colonies debated their next steps, the radical and conservative factions began to crystallize, leading to the next phase of the struggle for independence. Preparation for war. The First Continental Congress, September 1774. The British government's coercive acts against Massachusetts alarmed other colonies, making them realize their rights were under threat. In response, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, with 56 delegates from all colonies except Georgia. Peyton Randolph was elected president, and each colony was given one vote. Suffolk resolves. Joseph Galloway's plan to reconcile with Britain was rejected, while radicals passed the Suffolk resolves, declaring the coercive acts unconstitutional, urging the formation of a new government, and recommending economic sanctions against Britain. Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This document asserted the colony's right to life, liberty, property, and self-governance, rejecting 13 parliamentary acts since 1763. It called for the non-importation of British goods and established committees to enforce this. Despite these efforts, the British Parliament rejected colonial demands, declared Massachusetts in rebellion, and passed new coercive measures. This increased colonial anger, and by late 1774, tensions were high, with British troops seizing colonial arms and the Massachusetts House forming a provincial congress. Second Continental Congress, May 1775. Following the outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met on May 10, 1775, to prepare for war. They declared war on Britain, blamed the King's ministers, and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, which eventually grew to 400,000 men. The Declaration of Independence. As the conflict escalated, the call for complete independence grew louder. By July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. The document outlined the colony's right to abolish oppressive governments, listed grievances against King George III, and declared the United States free and independent, severing all ties with Britain. Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775. Following Lexington and Concord, colonial forces gathered at Boston. Despite being defeated by British troops at Bunker Hill, the battle convinced the colonists they could fight against British regulars. George Washington later took command and faced challenges in organizing the army but eventually captured Boston. Radicals capture assemblies. By the end of 1775, revolutionary governments began replacing colonial administrations, slowly advocating for independence. A significant move came from Virginia when Henry Lee proposed a resolution of independence in June 1776, which was eventually adopted by the Continental Congress, leading to the final Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. This declaration, while condemned by the British, was celebrated in France and elsewhere as a profound statement of freedom and democracy, solidifying the resolve for war and setting the stage for the United States' fight for independence. Course of the war. The war between the American colonies and Britain became inevitable after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. The conflict unfolded in three distinct phases. The first phase, 1775 to 1776. The initial phase saw Massachusetts as the primary battleground. The British aimed to showcase their power, but their efforts were met with resistance. The Battle of Bunker Hill, though a tactical win for the British, resulted in heavy losses. The colonists, under General George Washington, reorganized their forces. Despite a failed attempt to capture Canada, the colonists gained a crucial victory by seizing Boston in March 1776, forcing the British to retreat to Nova Scotia. The British then shifted their focus to New York, where General Howe's forces clashed with Washington's troops. Despite early setbacks, Washington's surprise attack at Trenton revitalized American morale, ending the first phase on a positive note for the colonists. The second phase, 1777 to 1778. The British strategy aimed to isolate New England and capture Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. General Burgoyne's campaign from Canada faced resistance and ultimately failed, culminating in his surrender at Saratoga in October 1777. Meanwhile, General Howe captured Philadelphia, but the American forces, despite suffering through a harsh winter at Valley Forge, emerged stronger. The victory at Saratoga was pivotal, convincing France to ally with the Americans in February 1778, providing crucial military and financial support. The final phase, 1778 to 1781. With French assistance, the tide turned in favor of the colonists. The final phase saw intense battles in the south, where British General Cornwallis faced American forces led by General Greene. Though Greene suffered defeats, his strategy of attrition weakened the British. The decisive moment came in 1781 when Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown by American and French forces. With the French Navy blocking reinforcements, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781, effectively ending the war in favor of the American colonists. The American victory was sealed with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, establishing the United States as an independent nation. The British surrender at Yorktown effectively ended the American Revolutionary War, although they continued to hold New York, Charleston, and Savannah for a while. The news of Cornwallis's surrender was a shock to British Prime Minister Lord North, who advised King George III to accept American independence. Despite his resistance, King George eventually conceded after the British Parliament, contrary to the King's wishes, voted to end the war on March 20, 1782. This led to the fall of North's government and the end of King George's personal rule, paving the way for a constitutional government in Britain. The Whigs, who came to power, sought a peaceful resolution with America to counter French influence. Preliminary peace terms were agreed upon in Paris on November 30, 1782, and the final treaty was signed on September 3, 1783. Terms of the treaty. Recognition of independence. Britain recognized American independence, ceasing hostilities and agreeing to withdraw its forces. Boundaries. The United States boundaries were set roughly at the Great Lakes and Canada to the north, the Mississippi River to the west, and Florida to the south at 31 degrees north latitude, giving America around 8,273,000 square miles of territory. Navigation and fishing rights. The Mississippi River was open to both nations, and Americans gained fishing rights off Newfoundland and the Canadian coast. Florida and Gibraltar. Florida was returned to Spain, while Britain retained Gibraltar in Europe. Loyalists and debts. Congress agreed to recommend the restoration of Loyalists' rights and property and to ensure debts owed to British merchants were paid without legal obstacles. Results and significance. Political change in Britain. The defeat led to the fall of Lord North's ministry, ending King George III's personal rule and re-establishing constitutional government in Britain. American independence. The 13 colonies became independent and united under the United States, forming a new nation. Government shift. Former royal and proprietary colonies transitioned to republics under the new Confederation. Loyalists. About 100,000 Loyalists were expelled, moving to Europe or Canada, removing the conservative element from American society. Church and slavery reforms. The Anglican Church was abolished in colonies where it was tax-supported. The slave trade was either prohibited or heavily taxed in 11 states, and slavery was abolished. Social reforms. There was progress in penal code and prison reforms, secularization of education, and broader participation in political life, laying the groundwork for equality and democracy in American society. After gaining independence, the American colonies faced significant challenges, both constitutional and economic. These issues took years to resolve, and the new nation had to address them through various measures. Constitutional problems. Lack of central government. Before independence, the colonies were controlled by Britain but had some autonomy. During the war, they were united under the Continental Congress, which lacked real governmental power. After the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation created a loose union of sovereign states with minimal central authority. This lack of an effective central government led to the need for a stronger federal system, addressed by the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. The new Constitution established a robust federal government with an executive, legislature, and judiciary. Bill of Rights. The original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, leading to demands for a formal list of protected freedoms. The first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were adopted shortly after the Constitution was ratified, ensuring essential liberties for citizens. Economic problems. Decline of commerce. Post-independence, American trade suffered due to British restrictions and high tariffs. Efforts to retaliate or limit British goods failed, but American trade with other regions, like the Baltic, eventually grew. National debt. The new government faced massive debts from the war. Attempts to address this through land sales and import duties were initially unsuccessful. The establishment of a national bank and a mint, along with paying off debts, helped stabilize the economy. Currency issues. With a lack of stable currency, many states issued paper money, which soon devalued. The government's response included creating the national bank and a uniform currency to restore financial stability. Shays' Rebellion highlighted the need for these changes. Political problems. Western lands. The governance of the Northwest Territory was initially problematic. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established a system for territorial administration and eventual statehood, balancing regional interests and preventing conflicts among states over Western lands. Foreign relations. Relations with Britain and Spain were strained. Britain failed to remove troops and honor pre-war debts, while Spain restricted American navigation rights and encouraged frontier conflicts. Agreements with both countries aimed to resolve these issues but faced difficulties in implementation. Conclusion: independence did not end the challenges for the American colonies. Instead, it led to significant constitutional, economic, and political issues that required years of effort to resolve, shaping the development of the new nation. That's a wrap for today, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon for notifications, like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next episode.